Amen. Let's go to Daniel chapter 1. And I wanted to read the first couple chapters of Daniel. There are a lot of lessons embedded in this text, and it's just wonderful to know the history and also to have an idea of what was going on in the lives of some great people. And we're going to start out in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, and it says, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah." Now, Jehoiakim was a son of Josiah, and you can read about that in Kings and Chronicles. So this is the reign of Jehoiakim. He was not a good king. He was actually quite an evil king. And the prophet Jeremiah prophesied that God was so angry at him that he would be, and the text is, he will be buried with the burial of a donkey, dragged out of Jerusalem and cast forth. So basically in the biblical world, they didn't bury donkeys. They just left them out in the open in the field until the rats and the vultures had eaten them up. And that's exactly what happened to Jehoiakim. So he wasn't a particularly good king. And verse 1 says, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it." Now, Nebuchadnezzar had just defeated the Assyrian army at Carchemish. And so he was the big dog on the block. By that time, and not the Assyrian army, the Egyptian army. And so everybody knew, wow, you didn't mess with Nebuchadnezzar. So he didn't send a full force to Jerusalem when it says he besieged Jerusalem. He sent almost an expeditionary force, and Jerusalem surrendered. And this is Jehoiakim. Now, the reason I want to point this out is because it says in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Keep a finger here or a marker here and go to Jeremiah chapter 25. You know, there are always people who are trying to disparage the word, point out problems in the word of God. Basically, they're wolves in sheep's clothing. They're unbelievers. They don't look for solutions. They look for problems. Here in Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 1, it says, "The word that came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the fourth year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah." This was the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Well, now, wait a minute. If this is the first year of Nebuchadnezzar and it's the fourth year of Jehoiakim, then why does Daniel say that Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon in the third year of Jehoiakim? Which is right? Jeremiah, the fourth year, or Daniel, the third year? And the answer is they're both right. And the reason they're both right is because in the biblical world, the writers of the Bible, like Jeremiah, like Daniel, wrote in the culture that they themselves lived in. And Daniel and Jeremiah used different dating systems. Like we know that time zones move from east to west. And so, you know, it can be like, for example, I can do something, let's take my team at work, and you get Dan Giffen, and he lives in Colorado. So I can do something at 10 in the morning, and then 2 hours later, he can do something at 10 in the morning. Now, is that a contradiction? No, it's that his 10 in the morning is 2 hours earlier than my 10 in the morning because of the way the time zones move. Well, if your calendar shifts differently, then the years on your calendar shift differently. And that's exactly what happened. And in fact, had Daniel and Jeremiah both said the same thing, that would have been a contradiction because they weren't the same. They didn't use the same calendar system. And we know that now, but for years and years and years, people didn't know that. So anyway, so that's why Daniel 1 opens up in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Verse 2, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. And again, of course, Jehoiakim was an evil person. He didn't have God on his side. And so Nebuchadnezzar moves in and conquers Jerusalem. And so it says the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the articles of the house of God. The house of God is, of course, the temple. And if you captured a nation, then you wanted to capture their God. Well, normally capturing a God is pretty easy because most cultures, around, for example, around Israel, you had the Philistines, they had a statue of Dagon. You had the Moabites, they had a statue of Milcom. You had the Ammonites, they had or Chemosh rather, you had the Ammonites, they had a statue of Milcom. So all the conquering army had to do was go into the temples and carry off the gods, except you go into the temple of Yahweh and got a problem. There's no statue because, God's invisible and immaterial, and he's the God of the earth. So there's no God to carry away. So what can you do? Well, you got to carry away some of his stuff. You can't carry away the God. So you carry away some of the articles that belong to the God. So that's what's going on here. He carried them into the land of Shinar to the house of his gods. And one of the ways that you show that one God submits to another is you take this one God and you put him in the temple of the more powerful God. You guys might remember 1 Samuel chapter 4, when the Philistines captured the ark of God and put it in the temple of Dagon. And theoretically, the ark of God was supposed to be subject to Dagon. But what happened? We know from 1 Samuel chapter 4, the statue of Dagon was bowing down on its face to the ark of Yahweh, which upset the Philistines to a tremendous degree. But anyway, so verse 2, Nebuchadnezzar takes articles of the house of God, brings them to Babylon. Verse 3, and the king spoke to Ashpenaz, the commander of his eunuchs, to bring some of the people of Israel, both from the royal seed and from the nobility. So this tells us right away that when we're reading Daniel, Daniel was either of the royal household or he was of the nobility. There's no way to tell from this text which it was, but it does make it very clear that Daniel was of the very upper crust of Judean society. And then it says, verse 4, youths in whom there was no blemish. And at this point in time, if you have men from the nobility or from the king's household and they're not married, then they would have to be probably 14 or younger. So at this point in time, I would place Daniel somewhere in the neighborhood of 13, 14, maybe 15, and that would be probably the upper limit. So Daniel is carried away to Babylon. And one of the things, when we talk about lessons here and attitudes of the mind, we as Christians really need to control our mindsets. And we live in a very mentally undisciplined world, very mentally undisciplined society. Frankly, in the United States of America, with all that we have, we live in a society of complainers because people complain if things aren't exactly the way they want. When you think about, like, I have a grandson who's 15 years old. He's dependent on his family, and obviously he looks to us for guidance and sustenance and support and all those kind of things. It would be life-wrenching for him to be torn away from our family and carried off to a foreign land where they spoke a foreign language and put into some kind of school, and just it could be mentally devastating. And yet we look at Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as we go through here, and there's not a hint that they were dissatisfied or hurt. They knew they had a job to do, and they went about doing it. And it's something that we can look at in our lives to, how purposeful are we in what we're doing? Do we know what we're doing? Do we know why we're doing it? Or are we looking around thinking that things aren't exactly the way we like, and so we're going to complain about it? Because you get a great example here of these 4 young men who are literally torn away from their homeland, torn away from their family, put into a situation where they don't know the language, they don't know the culture, and yet there's what you see in them is a tremendous desire to succeed, and they go about it well. So these are, verse 4, youths in whom there was no blemish, but good looking, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, and quick to understand, and such as had the ability to stand in the king's palace, and that he should teach them the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And we now know from archaeology that there's a wide range of Babylonian, this would be Akkadian in the Akkadian language, or in cuneiform writing. There is a tremendous amount of writing and literature in this language. And so here these men are supposed to learn the customs, learn the language, learn the literature, so that they can contribute to the Babylonian society, and actually, as we would see from the Babylonians' mindset, the Babylonian control of the world, because they would know both their homeland and their homeland's culture and customs, and they would know the Babylonian culture and customs and language, and they would be able to work seamlessly back and forth as ambassadors and that kind of thing. So this tells you something else about Nebuchadnezzar too. Nebuchadnezzar's forward-looking about his kingdom. And I know Nebuchadnezzar has a kind of a bad rap as far as a king is concerned. He ends up being a very, very powerful king and a godly man as well, but it took some doing to get him there. So verse 5, the king appointed for them a daily portion from the king's choice food and from the wine that he drank. And that's pretty powerful, because he's so invested in these young men, and these are young men from Judah, but he would have done this for the other kingdoms he conquered as well. Moab, Ammon, other kingdoms that he conquered, he would have done the same thing. And so he's interested enough in the stability of the future of his kingdom and the control that his kingdom has over the ancient Near East, that he's going to take the food that that gets served at his own table, and the wine that gets served at his own table, and he's going to give that to these children, basically, so that they can, obviously from his standpoint, have the best and grow up to be the biggest, the best, the strongest, all that kind of thing. Verse 6, now among these, meaning these children who were put into this program, now among these were, of the descendants of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The commander of the eunuchs gave names to them. To Daniel, he gave the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. And what it meant in the culture when you changed someone's name was that they had control over you. And that's basically the idea behind changing the name, to show a control, and also, though, to eventually unite them more deeply in the culture. You give them names that fit your culture, not their culture. And so that's what is going on here. Verse 8, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food, nor the wine that he drank. Now, why would the king's food and drink be defiling? And the answer to that is that the best meat and the best wine in the kingdom was offered to the gods, and then that was taken from pagan temples and brought to King Nebuchadnezzar's table. And so the wine and the food here, it's not that it's something like pork and they aren't supposed to eat pork. That wouldn't really be the case, although there may be things mixed in with the food that they weren't supposed to eat, various sea creatures and that kind of thing. but it's more about because wine, of course, you would never defile yourself really with wine. And so it's more about the fact that it was offered to idols. That's the greater problem here. So Daniel purposes in his heart that he's not going to defile himself with the king's choice food, nor with the wine that he drank. It's a kind of a mini lesson, a small lesson, but an important one, that there are things that are defiling in the sight of God. There are things that are sin in the sight of God. And it's important for Christians to make up our mind that we're not going to be involved in those things, because we want to live a life that pleases God. And so what Daniel did was a very bold move. So he asked permission of the commander of the eunuchs not to defile himself. Now, to understand what a bold move that is, the commander of the eunuchs, that's a position way up the line. that's like, on an army base going to the general. I mean, the commander of the eunuchs were the servants of the king. And so Daniel goes right to the top. He's not gonna mess around talking to somebody, of a lesser status that could not grant the permission. So he went to the commander of the eunuchs. Well, verse 9, now God granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the commander of the eunuchs, so that we know that the commander of the eunuchs liked Daniel. Now, why would the commander of the eunuchs like Daniel? Well, it had to be Daniel's attitude. I mean, obviously God, helps out in these things, but, Daniel had to have a good, positive attitude, a can-do attitude, a caring attitude toward the commander of the eunuchs, because that's how you make friends. That's how you give a good impression. And so the commander of the eunuchs liked Daniel, and that becomes important for what happens next. Verse 10, the commander of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse looking than the youths who are of your age? Then you would endanger my head to the king. And this is another interesting mini lesson, because the commander of the eunuchs likes Daniel. He'd like to be able to help Daniel out. But the first thing he's going to do is he's going to protect himself. And this is human nature, if you will. Even though the commander of the eunuchs liked Daniel, he's not going to risk his neck or his job for Daniel's benefit. And this is something we need to expect when we're dealing with people. Even when people like us, if they don't go out on a limb for us, take a risk for us, that doesn't mean they don't like us. Different people have, they get skitterish and afraid of different things. And that's something that we just have to overlook and figure out, okay, how do I end run this? How do I get down to, how do I move forward with this? Verse 11, and I think this is kind of brilliant on Daniel's part. So then Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the eunuchs had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So after the commander of the eunuchs said no, Daniel went to the lower station guy who was directly in charge of him. And with this lower station guy, he didn't give a blanket like, hey, I want vegetables to eat, like he did with the commander of the eunuchs. Now he gives a time frame. So verse 11, he talks to the overseer. And verse 12, test your servants, I beg you, 10 days, which that's reasonable. The overseer could probably do that. I beg you 10 days. Let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink, and then let our appearance be looked at in your presence, and the appearance of the youth who eat of the king's choice food. And as you see, deal with your servants. Seems like a fair request. 10 days shouldn't get you in too much trouble. Verse 14, so he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. Verse 15, at the end of 10 days, they were better in their appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the choice food. Now that had to be a bit of a God boost. I mean, sometimes you can change your complexion in 10 days if you do vegetables and water and, what do they call it, intermittent fasting and all the other things that we do to have a decent appearance. But generally what you see, is God working behind the scenes here as well to honor their request and to keep them from being defiled by the king's food. So verse 16, so the overseer looked at him and wow, they were doing much better than the other guys. So verse 16, so the overseer took away their choice food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Verse 17, and now we have a setup for Daniel chapter 2. Because it says in verse 17, now as for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and skill in every kind of literature and wisdom. And again, this would be the literature of the Babylonians, but perhaps some of the kingdoms that they conquered as well. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Verse 18, and at the end of the days that the king had appointed for bringing them in, the commander of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and among all of them, no one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they stood before the king, meaning that they were in front of the king to attend to him, advise him, to carry out orders, and that kind of thing. Verse 20, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters who were all in all his realm. And verse 20 is an interesting conflict because the magicians and the enchanters are getting their information from the dark side. So verse 20 actually is a battle between God and the devil, because you have God giving wisdom and understanding to Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and you have the devil trying to give his wisdom to the enchanters and magicians. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar saw that the godly wisdom was better. And that's something that, when James says, if anybody lacks wisdom, let him ask of God who gives generously. And that's precisely correct. One of the things we need to do, and one of the reasons we need to stay in prayer and also walk a holy walk, is because we want that constant communication with God. We want that blessing of God on our life. In Daniel's case, he was being forced to partake of things that were defiling, and he took a stand, and God blessed him, and he got those things out of his life, and he's now being fed wisdom and revelation from God, and the result of that is he's better than all the people who are getting their information from the dark side. And that's something we need to be aware of. And then verse 21 says, Daniel continued even to the first year of Cyrus. We know the Babylonian captivity was about 70 years. If Daniel was about 14 or so when he was carried captive, then Daniel is in his early to mid 80s by the time the Babylonian kingdom is overthrown and Cyrus the Persian is reigning. And Daniel continued, according to Daniel 10, he continued in the reign of the Persian Empire. So Daniel may well have ministered up into his late 80s, even his 90s, perhaps even older than 100 years old. The Bible doesn't tell us when Daniel stopped prophesying, but we know it was at least his early to mid 80s at the very least. So that's a lesson in and of itself that, there's no retirement age for being godly. So Daniel chapter 2, and in, the young men were to be trained for 3 years, but God kind of interrupted their training. Verse 1 says, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, and his spirit was troubled and his sleep went from him. Now, verse 1 is one of the verses that show us how flexible the word spirit is, because the word spirit, which is Ruach in Hebrew, and as you know, pneuma in Greek, the word spirit has many, many, many meanings. It can refer to God, Jesus Christ, angels, demons. It can be the wind. It can be your breath. It can be the Spirit of God inside you, the gift of Holy Spirit. It can refer to your thoughts, your attitudes, your emotions. Spirit has a huge range of meaning. Basically, the bottom line meaning behind spirit is it's something you can't see, it's invisible, but that exerts a force. So, for example, why is wind, the word spirit used of the wind? Because you can feel it, but you can't see it. The wind is exerting a force, but you can't see it, you can't grab it, you can't feel it. So wind is one of the categories of spirit. Breath is a category of spirit. Your thoughts are a category of spirit because you can definitely feel the effect of the way you think, and yet you can't see it, you can't grab a hold of it. So it's important to know the range of meanings to spirit, because when Nebuchadnezzar, when it says, and his spirit was troubled, what was troubled was his thoughts. You know, he has this dream, and he wakes up and his thoughts are troubled. But in biblical parlance, thoughts are spirits. So here, his spirit was troubled, and his sleep went from him. Verse 2, then the king, Nebuchadnezzar, commanded to call the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. That's a good thing to do, being obedient. So the king, Nebuchadnezzar, you can tell he's really bothered by this. Whatever this dream was, he doesn't know yet. Whatever this dream is, he's really bothered, because when you look at the people that were called out, he didn't leave any of them out. It's like, well, I need a few magicians, or I need a few enchanters. You know, he was really bugged by this. He calls the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, calls in the whole troop. Verse 3, king said to them, I've dreamed a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream, meaning my thoughts are troubled. I am troubled. My attitude is troubled to know the dream. Verse 4, then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in the Aramaic language. By the way, this section of Daniel is written in Aramaic, not Hebrew. So they spoke to the king in the Aramaic language. O king, live forever. That was a standard greeting, kind of like in Great Britain, the saying, you know, long live the king. And here in the ancient world, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. That was pretty standard. You know, you tell your dream to the wise men, and they would run off and they would have a powwow and they would think about it, and they would come up with an interpretation, and they would come back and give the interpretation. But as you can imagine, when you're trying to get information from the dark side and put things together according to your understanding, and you're not aligned with God, then a lot of the information you bring back is wrong, it's erroneous, it's unclear, whatever. And so verse 5, the king answered the Chaldeans, this is what I have decided. And this is very important to get the translation correct. If you read the King James Version and some of the older versions, a standard translation like in the King James is, the thing is gone from me. And the idea was that the king had forgotten the dream. Well, the king had not forgotten the dream. There is no genuinely modern version that I know of, and that includes the New King James, the New King James Version that translates it that way. The translators know that the way, what the Aramaic means here is basically, this is what I've commanded, this is what I've decided. And it gives us a view into Nebuchadnezzar's relationship with these wise people. these people who claim to be so wise, that he didn't trust them. Had this dream, it had a very powerful effect. We learn later that the dream is from God. And because the dream was from God, it had a very powerful effect, made a very, very distinct impression on his mind. He had not forgotten the dream, but he didn't trust his magicians. He didn't trust his wise men that they would come back and give the actual interpretation. And so verse 5, the king answered the Chaldeans, "This is what I have decided. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be cut in pieces and your houses will be made a dunghill." And this was no idle threat. We actually have rock cuts from the Assyrian Empire depicting men being chopped into pieces, arms cut off, legs cut off, and that kind of thing. So when Nebuchadnezzar says, "You will be cut in pieces," that was not a hyperbole. That was an actual punishment that was given to people in that time period if you displeased the king. Now, when it says, "In your houses will be made a dunghill," that's a little more difficult to understand because the word dunghill in the ancient Akkadian or Aramaic literature, it could be used of a house that was destroyed. In other words, this could be the equivalent of "we'll destroy your house," or "we will make your house a garbage dump," or "we will make your house a public bathroom." And all those usages appear in the ancient literature. So what exactly Nebuchadnezzar meant isn't clear. My tendency is to believe he said that we'll turn your house into a public bathroom, but there's no way to actually prove that. But in any case, whatever's going to happen to the house, it isn't good, but you yourself will be cut in pieces. So he says, well, you'll be cut in pieces and your houses will be made a dunghill. Verse 6, "But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you will receive gifts and rewards from me and great honor. So show me the dream and the interpretation." This is pretty simple. You can show me the dream and the interpretation and get great honor, or you can not do that and you get cut in pieces. So that's what's on the table. Verse 7, they're pretty obviously astounded at the intensity of this. Verse 7, they answered the second time and said, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation." Verse 8, the king answered, "I know for certain that you're trying to gain some time because you see this is what I've decided. But if you do not make known to me the dream, there's but one sentence for you have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me until time has changed things." And here we see Nebuchadnezzar's distrust for these guys. He says, I know you've prepared these lying and corrupt words, and you're waiting until time has changed things, and time could change a lot of things. Something had happened in Nebuchadnezzar's empire that would take his attention away from the dream. He might have another dream that would confuse him. There all kinds of different things could happen if you let time go by. And so Nebuchadnezzar says, you've prepared stuff to tell me and you're waiting for time to go by. Verse 9, the closing, "Therefore tell me the dream, and then I will know. You can show me its interpretation." And at this point, the wise men kind of put their foot in their mouth, because verse 10, it says, "The Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there's not a man on earth who can declare the matter for the king. So no king, lord, or ruler has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean." Verse 11, the king's asking a very difficult thing, and there's no one who can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. Now, the response of this is that Nebuchadnezzar is going to get really angry. But let's take a slightly deeper look at why that would be. What did the wise men, the Chaldeans, the enchanters, the soothsayers, what did they claim about themselves? They claimed that by dreams and visions and various types of divinations, they could hear from the gods. What's the point of having these magicians and wise men and enchanters and all these guys around what's the point of having them around if they can't hear from God about what the king should do? He might as well just think up his own pathway. So it's very interesting that these guys have been claiming to be able to communicate with the gods, get vision from the gods, hear voices from the gods, divine the will of the gods, all this stuff, until they actually have to produce what the gods have revealed. And then all of a sudden, well, no man can do that. You know, the gods, their dwelling is not with flesh. And so basically they've just condemned themselves. They've just said basically everything we've kind of made a living on has been sort of a lie. And Nebuchadnezzar apparently gets this. Verse 12, because of this, the king was violently angry and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Verse 13, so the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be slain, and they searched for Daniel and his companions to kill them. Now, it's not like they didn't know where Daniel and his companions were. They truly might have been out of pocket, you know, doing this or that or the other thing, but it wasn't like you had to search all over the kingdom. It just meant they went to find them where they were. And so they're going to kill Daniel and his companions as well as all the other wise men. Verse 14, then Daniel replied with counsel and prudence to Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, which it's, you know, if somebody's coming to kill you, it really helps if you can figure out what to say that might forestall that a little while. And so when it says that he replied with counsel and prudence, it indicates that he had some time to think about this. He may have heard that this was coming or whatever, but he replied with counsel and prudence to Arioch, the commander of the king's guard. And again, what you see is that he doesn't try to talk to a soldier who's coming to kill him, because the soldier can't stop what's going on. He's got to obey orders. So Daniel, just like the first time he went to the commander of the eunuchs about his food, here he goes to the commander of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered Arioch, the king's commander, why is the decree from the king so urgent? And this is interesting. The word urgent here in the Aramaic can mean both urgent and harsh. And I think both those meanings are important here. I mean, it's like, holy smokes, what did we do to the king that he's so angry that he wants to kill all the wise men? So that was part of the question. But part of it is, you know, what is the hurry? You know, no kind of trial, no kind of discussion, no kind of, you know, can we plead our case? You know, what is going on that this is so harsh and so urgent? And so let's see. And I'm in verse 15. And Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. So basically, remember, Daniel's in training. He's in the second year of a third year program. So he wasn't called before the king when all those other people were called before the king. And so now Arioch makes this thing known to Daniel. Now, verse 16, so Daniel went in and asked the king to give him some time so that he could show the king the interpretation. I'm really sad that conversation is not in the Bible. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar was really super furious. And what Daniel did by this time, if he was taken out of Judah when, say, he was 14, so by this time he's maybe 16 years old. On the high side, maybe 17. He may have only been 15. And he goes in, and whatever he said to the king, and however he managed to get that audience. And this is a God thing, and when we pray, we've got to have trust that God's going to move. And I'm sure Daniel was praying, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were praying so that they would save their lives, and God gave them mercy. Something in the king's heart opened up a little bit, but it would be just, that would be such, if that was filmed, if there was movie cameras at that time to film Daniel going into King Nebuchadnezzar, how he talked to him, what he said to him, to beg for time. And in verse 16, so he went in, asked the king to give him some time so he could show the king the interpretation, and he must have been incredibly convincing. Verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, so that they could request the mercy of the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions would not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So they're praying to God for mercy so that they can, just save their lives. And of course, God would like to save their lives, so he's going to move powerfully here. Verse 19, then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night, and Daniel blessed the God of heaven. So they were given at least one day to put this thing together, because Daniel, went through the night, and in a vision of the night, he got the answer. Verse 20, Daniel answered, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. Verse 21, he changes the times and the season. He removes kings. He sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. By the way, that's really true. He gives wisdom to the wise, but also people that want to be wise have to go to the well, if you will, to ask for wisdom. We just don't live our life, eat, drink, go to bed, and somehow get wisdom. Wisdom is in the Word of God. And as we read the Word of God and put it on in our mind and put it on in our heart and start to live it out, then our wisdom will increase. There's that psalm in Psalm 119 that I have more wisdom than the aged because I know your word. And it's really true that there's great wisdom in the word. And so when it says he gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding, Proverbs says, if you want wisdom and understanding, you have to search for it. You have to dig for it, like it's hidden treasure. And there's great hidden treasure in the Word of God. And that's why we read it all the time, to get that wisdom. There's other things we get too, but that's one of the reasons. And then verse 22, he reveals the deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. Verse 23, I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers, who has given me wisdom and might, and now has made known to me what we ask of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. And that's a great prayer of thanksgiving, and again, a wonderful model of how we should thank God for things. And so verse 25 or verse 24, then Daniel went in to see Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and spoke to him as follows, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the interpretation to the king. Verse 25, then Arioch brought Daniel in before the king in haste and spoke to the king as follows. I have found a man of the children of the captivity of Judah who will make known to the king the interpretation. And Arioch is a shameless self-promoter. Daniel went to him, and yet he goes to the king, I have found a person, and so he's looking for a reward and promotion for the king. And it's just kind of a side note, we're constantly looking for lessons that we learn from the Bible, just little lessons that are scattered throughout the Bible. Here we see one that, natural people, Arioch, I'm sure he was a native Babylonian, he was a pagan, and he's interested in himself. So he's going to go in, I have found a man. When he didn't find the man found him. But that's the way people are. They're going to be They're going to say and do things that help make them succeed. Verse 26, the king answered Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, "Are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation?" And Daniel here is really super wise in the way he answers that question. Can you make known to me the dream and the interpretation? And then Daniel, verse 27, answered before the king and said, "The secret that the king has asked about cannot be explained to the king by the wise men, enchanters, magicians, or soothsayers." So the first thing Daniel does is he points out that who can't help, and they are the people that have tried to help the king forever, these magicians that have been hanging around. Verse 28, but there's a God in heaven who reveals secrets. So Daniel is going to promote God, and particularly in this case, the God of the Hebrews. And he's in heaven. He reveals secrets. He has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dreams and the visions of your head on your bed are these. Verse 29, as for you, O king, your thoughts came into your mind on your bed about what should happen in the future. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will happen. So this is another insight into Nebuchadnezzar. We already know that he's invested in the future because he's investing so much in these young men that he's training up in the language and culture of the Chaldeans. And so here he's laying on his bed. He's thinking what's going to happen in the future. Now, the answer to that Nebuchadnezzar got was probably far more than he wanted. Nebuchadnezzar probably wanted to know, who should succeed me as kings, what's going to happen to the Babylonian Empire. Instead, God shows him the rest of history. But it's kind of interesting. So he who reveals secrets is made known to you what will happen. Verse 30, but as for me, the secret was not revealed to me because of any wisdom that I have more than any other living person, but so that its interpretation may be known to the king, and so that you may understand the thoughts of your heart. And that's a good answer because it magnifies the king. What he's doing there is he's saying, the reason that God revealed this is because you are so important. And of course, King Nebuchadnezzar loves that. Oh yeah, I'm so important. God would show me how future is going to play out. It's probably not actually that true, but it certainly blessed Nebuchadnezzar and got him in the right state of mind. Verse 31, as you were looking, O king, behold, there was a large statue. The statue, which was mighty and of exceeding brightness, was standing before you, and its appearance was frightening. And, you've all probably had dreams where something shows up in the dream that startles you. Sometimes it could startle you or frighten you to the point that you even wake up. And so here's this giant statue right in front of Nebuchadnezzar. Its appearance was frightening. Verse 32, as for this statue, its head was of fine gold, its breast and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet part of iron and part of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out, but not by human hands, and it struck the statue on its feet that were of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Now you and I know that the stone that was cut out without hands is the Messiah, the Lord Jesus Christ. And he was not, and of course he's the Son of God, so he wasn't made by human hands. The stone wasn't made by human hands, it was made by God. And the stone strikes the statue, verse 35, then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold were broken in pieces together and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so there was not a trace of them that could be found. But the stone that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. And this is a reference to the millennial kingdom on earth. And it's interesting, there's many other verses that talk about when Christ sets up his kingdom on earth, comes down from heaven, fights the battle of Armageddon, conquers the earth, sets up his kingdom. Note that it says that no trace of these other kingdoms can be found. There will not be any idols or idolatry on the earth. All those kingdoms and their various idol gods will be gone. There won't be a trace of them left. So he says, verse 36, this is the dream, and we will tell its interpretation before the king. You, O king, are the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And wherever the children of men live, or the animals of the field, or the birds of the heavens, he is given into your hand, and has made you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. After you will arise another kingdom. Now that's important, because Nebuchadnezzar would normally be thinking about who's going to be the king after me. And we know that was Nebuchadnezzar, then there was Nergal-sharezer, then there was evil Merodach, then there was Nabonidus, and Nabonidus went off and was running around the empire and appointed Belshazzar to be the regent in his place there in Babylon, and that's why Belshazzar shows up in chapter 5. So Nebuchadnezzar is probably thinking about, oh, who's going to rule after me? And instead, God says, okay, your kingdom, which means your dynasty, is going to disappear. After you, verse 39, will arise another kingdom, but it'll be inferior to you. We know that was the Persian Empire. Another third kingdom of bronze will rule over the earth. That was the Grecian Empire. Verse 40, the fourth kingdom will be as strong as iron, because iron breaks in pieces and subdues all things. And as iron that crushes, all these will break in pieces and crush. And of course, the Iron Empire is the Roman Empire, and it really did subdue the other empires in a way that the Greeks and the Persians did not. Verse 41, whereas you saw the feet and the toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, it will be a divided kingdom, but there will be in it the strength of iron, because you saw the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom will be partly strong and partly broken. And as you get into the 70 weeks of Daniel later on, the Roman Empire has a hiatus, and then you have the continuation of that picture of an empire in the empire of the latter days and of the Antichrist. And that's what you're looking at here with the empire, part of iron, part of clay. And verse 43, whereas you saw the iron mixed with miry clay, they will mix themselves with the seed of men, but they will not cling to one another, even as iron does not mingle with clay. Verse 44, and again, in the days of those kings, and you've got all the various kings that are reigning in the time of the book of Revelation. It talks about, 10 kings and that kind of thing. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. That's Christ's kingdom on earth. Nor will its sovereignty be left to another people, but it will break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it will stand forever. So this is Christ's kingdom, and all the other kingdoms, like I say, are gone, consumed. They don't exist on the earth. Verse 45, because you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. The great God has made known to the king what will happen in the future, and the dream is certain, and its interpretation sure. Verse 46, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and prostrated himself before Daniel, and that would have been amazing to see, because that it's really hard to express how that interpretation must have affected Nebuchadnezzar for him to do that. And he commanded that they should offer an offering and sweet odors to him, which is really interesting, kind of elevating Daniel to the level of a God-man, kind of. Verse 47, the king answered and said to Daniel, truly your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, since you've been able to reveal this secret. Then the king made Daniel great, gave him many gifts, made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief governor over all the wise men of Babylon. Verse 49, Daniel requested of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel was in the gate of the king, meaning Daniel was an appointed officer of rank in the very gate of the palace, setting policy and that kind of thing for the empire. 49 contains another interesting lesson, which Daniel did not just accept the promotion, if you will, didn't just accept the promotion for himself, but then he immediately went out and found other godly people who he wanted to be promoted as well. And that's something that we as Christians need to be aware of, is that anytime we have the power and ability to do so, we should seek the welfare of other Christians and see if we can promote them. So then Daniel, this is how Daniel becomes a very important person in the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. And then by Daniel 5, he's forgotten, but then promoted again when he interprets the message that God gave to Belshazzar, writing on the wall of the palace. And then it was as when Belshazzar was killed, it was Daniel as the second highest ranking person in the kingdom who got to meet with Cyrus. And then we see the effect of that meeting when Cyrus lets the people go back, lets the Israelites go back to Judah. So this is the opening of Daniel. Lots and lots of great lessons in here, not to mention the fact that it is history. It is what happened. So it's good for us to know it. So thank you for your attention tonight. It's great to be with you and get to expound this.